The Diddy case because the prosecution has rested and the defense, this case is going to be over as early as Friday.
Diddy's trial just hit a major snag, and it's nothing short of jaw-dropping. Prosecutors have unexpectedly dropped explosive charges, including kidnapping, attempted arson, and even aiding in sex trafficking. So, what's really going on behind the scenes, and how will this affect Diddy's future? Stay tuned, because the shocking truth might just surprise you. Diddy's legal woes have been dominating headlines for months, and with each new twist, the stakes seem to get higher. The charges against him were nothing short of explosive: racketeering, sex trafficking, and even kidnapping.
Arguments are now set for Thursday. Presumably, it will not take more than a day, and the jury could get this case on Friday. Now, I say as early as Friday, I don't think that's going to happen.
These accusations painted a chilling picture of the mogul's empire, suggesting dark and dangerous ties to criminal activities. Prosecutors were prepared to make these serious charges the foundation of their case, with testimonies from key witnesses like Kid Cudi and others set to back up their claims. But just as the trial seemed to be picking up momentum, things took a dramatic turn. In a stunning move, prosecutors have decided to drop some of the most critical charges, leaving many to wonder, why? Was the evidence against Diddy just not strong enough to hold up?
This is where prosecutors have to paint a picture of Diddy as a racketeer, as someone who cajoles and forces people.
Or is something else happening behind the scenes? This unexpected shift has left everyone questioning the trajectory of the case and what this means for Diddy's future in the spotlight. In a shocking development, prosecutors have dropped several major charges that were once at the heart of Diddy's case. Among the most significant are accusations of kidnapping, attempted arson, and aiding in sex trafficking. These charges weren't just peripheral, they were pivotal to the racketeering charge that the prosecution was hoping would bring Diddy to justice. So, what exactly does this mean for the case moving forward? First, the kidnapping charges. Two women, Jane and Capricorn Smith, had claimed they were kidnapped by Diddy or his associates, with one alleging abduction at the London Hotel in West Hollywood and the other at a warehouse over stolen jewelry.
Prosecutor Comey is a master at this. She did an amazing job in the Maxwell case, and I would expect she's going to be as compelling as can be on Thursday.
These allegations were painted as key parts of the prosecution's case, showing a pattern of control and intimidation. But now, the prosecutors have made the decision to remove this charge entirely. Why? The exact reasons remain unclear, but it suggests that the evidence wasn't strong enough to secure a conviction. Without these claims, the prosecution loses a significant piece of their case. Next, the attempted arson charge, which was linked to the infamous incident involving Kid Cudi's car. A Molotov cocktail was thrown at Cudi's vehicle, and the prosecution had framed this act as being the result of jealousy. Allegedly, Diddy ordered the attack. This event was supposed to be a centerpiece in the racketeering argument, but prosecutors now claim they can't prove Diddy's involvement beyond a reasonable doubt. With this charge gone, the narrative they were building around organized criminal activity falls apart, and the case becomes a lot less dramatic. Lastly, the aiding and abetting sex trafficking charges have been significantly scaled back. The prosecution had initially accused Diddy of facilitating illegal activities by allegedly booking hotel rooms and being involved in the trafficking process. However, they're now focusing on the core sex trafficking charges, leaving the smaller claims aside. This move is curious, considering the severity of the charges. It may suggest that prosecutors believe they don't have the evidence needed to prove Diddy's direct involvement in these activities. So, what does this all mean for the future of Diddy's trial? The dropped charges raise more questions than answers. The case has clearly lost some of its strongest elements, but will the remaining charges be enough to bring Diddy down? Only time will tell, but one thing's for certain, the game has changed. One of the most shocking and sensational parts of Diddy's case involved the alleged arson of Kid Cudi's car. The incident, which saw a Molotov cocktail thrown at Cudi's vehicle, was initially portrayed by the prosecution as a direct act of retaliation ordered by Diddy. The narrative was simple: a fit of jealousy, a powerful mogul taking matters into his own hands, and a violent attack meant to send a message. It seemed like a key moment in the case, as the prosecution tried to connect this event to a broader pattern of criminal activity that could ultimately nail Diddy for racketeering.
A freak dude, no doubt about that, but the way all of this is coming out, piece by piece, story after story, it feels less like a search for justice and more like character assassination via legal means.
But now, in a stunning turn of events, prosecutors have dropped the attempted arson charge from the case. This isn't just a small change, it's a massive shift in how they're framing their argument. Why? For all the drama surrounding the Molotov cocktail attack, there was never enough concrete evidence to tie Diddy directly to the incident. Sure, the idea of a jealous outburst makes for a compelling story, but there was no solid proof linking Diddy to the attack. Without that proof, the prosecution's case becomes much weaker.
I don't think the prosecution team has proven its case totally. I think some arguments were put forward, interesting, to shame Diddy.
Kid Cudi's testimony was supposed to be a key piece in this puzzle, and his story about the fire and the subsequent fallout seemed like it could tip the scales in favor of the prosecution. But even though Cudi's testimony painted a vivid picture, it didn't provide the direct evidence needed to implicate Diddy. The theory that Diddy might have ordered the attack was more speculation than fact. While it's easy to speculate, especially when looking at the timeline of events, such as Diddy allegedly having a run-in with Cudi, the prosecution could never solidly tie Diddy's name to the Molotov cocktail or prove he was behind it. By dropping the arson charge, the prosecution seems to be acknowledging a simple truth: they couldn't make it stick. And that's a significant blow to their case. It removes one of their most dramatic pieces of evidence, leaving them with a much smaller arsenal as they continue to press their remaining charges. This shift also raises the question of whether the prosecution knew all along that they were grasping at straws with this charge, but they needed something dramatic to keep the public's attention and build a stronger narrative. The dropped arson charge makes one thing clear: the prosecution's case isn't as airtight as they once claimed. With this key charge out of the picture, the spotlight now falls on the remaining accusations, and it'll be interesting to see how they'll fare without the weight of such a high-profile incident behind them. But as we've seen time and time again, this case is far from over, and the next twist might be even more unexpected. The kidnapping charges against Diddy were among the most shocking elements of the case. Two women known as Jane and Capricorn Smith had alleged that they were forcibly taken by Diddy's associates. Jane claimed she was abducted from the London hotel in West Hollywood, while Capricorn alleged she was kidnapped at a warehouse, accused of stealing Diddy's jewelry. These allegations painted a picture of a man exerting control and intimidation in the most extreme ways, using kidnapping as a tool to enforce his power and keep people in line. For a time, these claims seemed to be a central part of the prosecution's case. The kidnapping charges were framed as evidence of the kind of ruthless criminal behavior that could back up the racketeering accusations. If Diddy was willing to kidnap individuals, it painted a chilling portrait of a man willing to go to any lengths to protect his empire and maintain his influence. However, the recent decision to drop the kidnapping charges has cast a major shadow over the case. Why were these charges, once so integral to the prosecution's strategy, suddenly dismissed? There are a few possible reasons, and one of the most likely is the lack of concrete evidence. While the testimony of Jane and Capricorn might have sounded compelling, the prosecution struggled to provide definitive proof that a kidnapping ever occurred. Without physical evidence, such as surveillance footage or corroborating witnesses, the allegations were left vulnerable. This is a huge blow to the prosecution. The kidnapping charges were key to illustrating the extent of Diddy's alleged criminal activities, and without them, the case loses a lot of its sting. Now, the narrative shifts. The prosecution no longer has the dramatic story of kidnapping and forced abductions to rely on. Instead, they'll have to focus on the remaining charges, which are much less sensational in comparison. But this move also raises questions. Could the prosecution have dropped the kidnapping charge because they realized it wouldn't hold up in court? Or was there something else at play here? Could it be a sign that the case is unraveling faster than anyone expected? Whatever the reason, one thing is clear. With the kidnapping allegations off the table, Diddy's legal team has gained a significant advantage. The trial has just taken another unexpected turn, and the outcome is looking more uncertain than ever. The charges of aiding and abetting sex trafficking were among the most serious accusations in Diddy's case. The prosecution had painted a picture of Diddy as not just an alleged perpetrator, but as someone involved in orchestrating and facilitating illegal activities behind the scenes. The accusations suggested that Diddy had played a role in facilitating sex trafficking, whether through booking hotel rooms, arranging meetings, or being involved in other logistical aspects of the operation. This charge, if proven, could have had devastating consequences for the mogul, not just legally, but in terms of his public image. But now, like with the arson and kidnapping charges, prosecutors have backed away from some of these claims. While sex trafficking charges still remain on the table, the specific allegations of aiding and abetting are being scaled back. The prosecution had initially suggested that Diddy's actions went beyond simple association and into active involvement. Things like helping set up locations or arranging situations where trafficking could take place. But now, it seems they are acknowledging that the evidence to support these more specific claims may not be as strong as they had hoped. The decision to drop some of the aiding and abetting elements of the case raises several questions. Was this a strategic move to focus more narrowly on the core sex trafficking charges, or does it signal that prosecutors never had the solid evidence they needed to prove Diddy's active involvement? For instance, the acts of booking hotel rooms or making travel arrangements might seem suspicious, but they don't necessarily point to criminal intent without more concrete evidence of wrongdoing. It's likely that the prosecution has reassessed the strength of their case here, realizing that proving Diddy was directly involved in these illegal activities might be more difficult than initially thought. In fact, they've hinted at the possibility that things like hotel bookings may not rise to the level of criminal behavior needed for a conviction. This is a critical shift in the case, as it essentially removes one of the more complicated charges from the equation. That said, the remaining sex trafficking charges are still very serious, and prosecutors are focusing on the idea that consent can be withdrawn at any time during a sexual encounter, even if it was initially given. This tactic counters the defense's argument, which claims that certain women involved had consented to their interactions with Diddy in the past. The prosecution is pushing the idea that consent is not a one-time agreement. It can change, and they want the jury to understand that. Ultimately, the scaling back of aiding and abetting charges seems to point to a bigger issue. The prosecution might not have the concrete proof they need to fully charge Diddy with these actions. But with the core sex trafficking charges still in play, the trial is far from over. Diddy's legal team may have gained some ground, but the fight is far from finished. The real question now is whether the remaining charges will be enough to carry the case to a conviction, or if the prosecution will continue to struggle with proving their most serious claims. While the prosecution is pushing hard to make its case, Diddy's defense team is equally determined to dismantle the charges against him. Central to their defense is the argument that the women involved in the case, particularly Cassie and Jane, had given consent at various points in their interactions with Diddy. The defense claims that, in each of these situations, the women were not coerced or manipulated. They chose to engage with Diddy willingly. The key issue here is consent, and the defense has emphasized it heavily. Diddy's legal team has presented text messages and other evidence suggesting that Cassie, in particular, had shown consent through her communications and actions. Their strategy is clear. If consent was given at one point, it should be considered valid unless there is strong evidence suggesting otherwise. However, the prosecution is flipping this narrative. They argue that consent is not a one-time agreement, but something that can be withdrawn at any point, regardless of prior interactions. This has become a major point of contention in the trial, as the prosecution tries to counter the defense's claims that the women willingly participated in the activities in question. According to the prosecution, even if these women consented to certain acts in the past, they could still later withdraw their consent, and the law would protect that right. This is a critical part of the prosecution's strategy. They're not just fighting the notion that these women consented once, they're trying to make the jury understand that consent is fluid and can change over time. This argument could prove to be a significant challenge for the defense, which is focused on showing that the interactions between Diddy and the women were mutual and consensual from the beginning. At the heart of the defense's argument is a simple but powerful claim. The women involved knew exactly what they were doing, and at no point did Diddy coerce or force anyone into anything. But the prosecution isn't backing down. They want to highlight the broader context of these relationships, suggesting that even if there was initial consent, it doesn't excuse any of the alleged subsequent actions. This brings us back to the question of power dynamics. If Diddy was in a position of authority over these women, the prosecution argues, it's possible that any consent given was not entirely free from influence or pressure. This is where the legal battle is shaping up to be most intense, the interpretation of consent and whether it was ever truly revoked or manipulated. With both sides presenting such starkly different perspectives, the outcome of this argument could be pivotal in the trial. If the jury buys into the defense's narrative that consent was given and never revoked, Diddy could emerge victorious. But if the prosecution convinces the jury that consent can be withdrawn at any time and that it was ultimately the women's right to do so, then Diddy could face serious consequences. This will likely be one of the most hotly debated points of the trial, with both sides pulling out all the stops to prove their case. The recent developments in Diddy's case, particularly the dropping of key charges, have sent shockwaves through the trial, and now the question on everyone's mind is, what happens next? With the prosecution scaling back their charges, the trajectory of the trial has shifted dramatically. The dramatic drop in charges, especially those related to kidnapping, arson, and aiding in sex trafficking, leaves the prosecution with much less ammunition to work with. These charges were supposed to be the backbone of the case, and without them, the remaining accusations feel less explosive and harder to prove. The prosecution is now left to focus on a more streamlined case, centered on sex trafficking and the argument about consent. This is a much narrower path, and without the weight of the earlier charges, their case could lose some of its initial intensity. The defense, on the other hand, is likely feeling more confident. With the kidnapping and arson charges out of the picture, they now have less to defend against, which could give them a clearer path to victory. The question is whether the remaining charges will carry enough weight to change the overall outcome of the case. One of the biggest wildcards right now is how the jury will respond to these changes. The dropped charges might influence the jury's perception of Diddy's involvement in the alleged criminal activities. Without the highly dramatic elements of kidnapping and arson to focus on, it's possible that the jury could start questioning the credibility of the remaining accusations. If they begin to feel that the prosecution's case is falling apart, they might be more inclined to side with the defense, which argues that the women consented to their interactions with Diddy. However, the prosecution is still pushing a strong argument that consent isn't always permanent and that it can be withdrawn at any time, even after it has been initially given. This legal nuance is key, and it could potentially sway the jury if they find the defense's argument about consent unconvincing. The prosecution is banking on the idea that the jury will understand the complexities of consent in these situations and see Diddy's actions as predatory, even if consent was given at some point. Another factor to consider is the judge's role. If the judge decides to address the dropped charges directly in the jury instructions, it could further influence how the jury deliberates. If the judge makes it clear that certain testimony, like the accounts from Kid Cudi or the women involved in the kidnapping allegations, should not be considered, it could significantly impact the jury's thought process. On the flip side, if the judge does not emphasize the changes, jurors might still bring up those earlier charges during deliberation, potentially muddying the waters. As things stand, the trial feels more unpredictable than ever. With the dropped charges, Diddy's legal team has gained some crucial ground, but the remaining charges are still serious and could be enough to bring about a conviction. The prosecution is now in a tight spot, and with a more focused, less dramatic case, they'll need to rely on their ability to convince the jury of the core allegations. The twists and turns of this trial are far from over, and the final verdict could hinge on how these remaining charges are presented and interpreted in the coming days. As the Diddy case continues to unfold, one thing is clear: this legal battle is far from over. The dramatic dropping of key charges such as kidnapping, attempted arson, and aiding in sex trafficking has completely shifted the landscape of the trial. The prosecution now faces the daunting task of proving their case with a much narrower set of allegations, and the defense has gained a significant advantage with these key charges removed. But despite these changes, Diddy is still far from out of the woods. The remaining sex trafficking charges are no small matter, and the battle over the issue of consent will likely become the focal point as the trial moves forward. So, what's next for Diddy? Will the prosecution be able to make their case without the explosive charges they once relied on? Or will the defense succeed in convincing the jury that the women involved consented and that Diddy's actions were not criminal? The next few weeks will be critical, and as new details continue to emerge, the outcome of this trial remains uncertain. But here's the million-dollar question. What do you think? Do the dropped charges mean Diddy is off the hook, or do you think the remaining accusations are serious enough to still put him in jeopardy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This case is far from over, and we'd love to hear your take on where it's headed.